Again, we also know that, and this is something that is part of any basically system almost in our entire body, that only if functional connections are made do those connections survive. It's also like that, especially here in the spinal cord for the corticospinal connections here in the cat, that during normal development there is some extent of crossing over so that both sides of the cortex innervate to some extent both sides of the spinal cord. But following a critical period of about 2 to 3 months, you end up with a spinal cord which is only innervated from the contralateral side, so that the ipsilateral connections disappear. We know that partly the same thing happens in humans, that we also have quite a lot of ipsilateral connections to begin with, probably 20–30%, which seem to be functional from early on, but around 10–11 years of age, many of these seem to at least be non-functional. They may still exist, but they are no longer being used, pretty much in the same way as what happens here in the cat. It turns out that this development, this change, depends on whether the connections become active or not. So if you block one part of the motor cortex, you see that following this critical period where that part is then not being used, then the other side take over and sort of dominate. So it's a competition between the two sides which takes place in this critical period. The input which is the most functional will be the one which survives, whereas the others will degenerate. You can also show this by simple interference with the ability of the cat to produce movement. So in this case, they have injected Botox, which blocks the neuromuscular transmission. So the cat is no longer able to actually use the paw during this critical period, just 1 week that they do this. And then they look at the development of the ability of the cat to use the paw and the connections in the spinal cord following this period. And it turns out that there is a very close correlation. So if you block the ability of the cat to use the paw during this period, you see that there are actually lasting changes in the ability of the cat to use the paw if you interfere with functional activation during that period. So you need that interaction between, again, the genetically determined outgrowth of the connections and the use of the connections in order to get a functioning limb here. Just very quickly, I know many of you have already encountered this in relation to one of the bachelor courses, so I'm not going to use a lot of time on this, but just briefly mention that it's still being a debate whether we have similar critical periods in humans. If they are there, they are definitely much more longer lasting than what we see in the cat. In the cat, it's maybe a month or so during early development. In humans, if there are really any critical periods, it's probably many, many years. And in any case, it's not an either or. It's not like you have to have specific events happening during that critical period in order to ensure that a specific function actually develops. There's still possibilities of developing that function even though you don't establish it during that critical period. So one of the examples is the ability to use both eyes, and especially to have three-dimensional vision using both eyes, which definitely in the cat, if you interfere with the vision of one eye, you see that the cortical neurons in the visual cortex don't end up responding to light coming into that eye following this critical period. In humans, it's not like that. It's not a complete either or. So even though you can have strabismus in human subjects where the eyes are not aligned and therefore vision on one eye is being reduced a bit, it's certainly correct that it's a good idea to correct this as early on as possible, but it's not really a problem if you do it later on. You can still learn to use the two eyes together and you can have intact vision on both eyes. The same goes for the motor system, the same goes for many other things. We all know that it's more easy to learn a new language when you're relatively young, probably up to the age of 14, 15 or so, but it doesn't mean that you cannot learn a new language later on. It just means that you don't become as good at it maybe, or that it's more difficult to learn it, but it's still possible. So we don't have critical periods to that same extent. So I'm going to take a break and then use maybe 10 minutes of the next hour, because I've been spending a little bit too much time going through this. So this is what I had about the early development of the nervous system. I would just like to mention that you should really enjoy the time that you have now, because with the age that you have right now, this is when your brain is probably functioning the best that it ever will. Part of the evidence for that is certainly that most measures do suggest that the brain is fully developed around the age of 20 to 30. And if you look at some people, I mean, Albert Einstein, most of the pictures that you see of Albert Einstein, he's a really, really old man with white hair and everything. But at that time, he wasn't really producing any good science. He made a lot of mistakes later on. His only really, really, really good, well, he did a few other things, it's true. But if you look at it, it was 3 papers which created his fame, all published in 1905 when he was 26 years old. Since then, later on, he didn't produce anything which came just near to what he produced at that age. If you look at the Nobel Prize for finding the DNA, James Watson was 26 years old. Garry Kasparov was 22 when he won the world championship in chess. So it's really between the 20 and 30s that you need to do things. So break, and then I take a little bit of the next lesson.